Hi, everybody. My name is Danielle. I'm the founder of Tackle What's Next and a founding member alongside some fabulous organizations of the Making Sports More Equitable Coalition. We are launching this initiative to create conversations around equity and inclusion in sports, and specifically around how all of us can help make the sports industry more equitable. Our first topic is around athlete activism and how it plays a role in making the sports industry that much more equitable. And we're really focusing on how sports organizations, but also individuals and all of us in our own roles can keep the momentum going, especially embracing the activism from athletes and continuing to empower them to use their voices to advocate for the necessary changes in sports and in other areas of life. Our second conversation in this series is with someone who does that, just that, Angela LaChica, founder and CEO of LaChica Sports. So Angela, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this.
Awesome. Well, let's just start with LaChica Sports, telling us a little bit about that. You guys work at the intersection of community impact and strategic marketing. Why are those intersections, like why is that intersection important? And how does social impact, athlete activism, and strategic marketing all play a role together?
Yeah, I think the intersection is so important because it allows, I think selfishly it allows us to be able to use the athlete platform to give back in a meaningful way in ways that we can't necessarily. So it's been really exciting to see how it's developed over the years. I started my career doing the local community events, the bowling tournaments, the golf tournaments and all of that. And as we started to develop and get more involved in the social justice space and really being able to impact hundreds of thousands of people, when we're talking about legislative work, has just been an honor and a highlight of my career. But I think the most important thing that I'm proud of with LaChica Sports is that we're women led and women ran. So there's 9 of us behind the scenes, owned and operated, and just, I think that's so important in a male dominated industry, and being able to support one another when you're talking about, lifting up your female colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask about that. So I'm glad you brought that up. What are some of the things that organizations in sports need to be doing to attract and bring in more women into the industry? Specifically, I would say like women of color, whether it's marketing, PR, sports front office, what are things that people in those organizations can do to become, more embracing of women and women of color specifically?
Well, I think it's really important that it's not just about bringing women or women of color into these organizations, but putting them in leadership positions. It's one thing to just have, that demographic taken care of, but that doesn't make sense and that doesn't add to the true value of an overall organization. But when you have a lot of different voices and a lot of different backgrounds in management positions, I think it only enhances the organization itself and, the greater cause.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we had chatted a little bit before we hit record about, the idea of bringing people in the door is great, but how are you actually going to help them grow within the organization? Do they have opportunities? Otherwise, they're probably not going to stick around. So I think that's an important point. And I'm glad to see that you guys have 9 women that are growing, advancing, doing all these amazing things with LaChica Sports. And so I want to talk about really the work you guys do. So if people aren't familiar with LaChica Sports, what is it? What do you guys do? What was the idea behind it? And what kind of work are you guys doing today?
Sure. The idea behind it was, I've been in sports my entire career. I started with the San Diego Padres when I was 14, kind of was a little unclear about my age, and I was able to get an internship and understand that I could work and be in sports business. So my trajectory was kind of set then, but I just loved being around a bunch of different sports and a bunch of different opportunities. And I loved the idea of being able to conduct business in a very specific way, in a way that was true to me and my moral compass. Especially those early days in the sports industry were difficult. And so as much as I struggled to get my company off the ground, it was really important that I did it with, integrity and hard work. And I got, turned down a lot, but we were fortunate to be able to kind of have some life be brought back into us when it came to the social justice efforts. And that has really taken an overload of our work now. So we're able to have evolved from strategic marketing and public relations, and really focus heavily on athlete impact and what that long-term, addressing systemic racism really has looked like, and using the athlete platforms in the most intentional way.
Yeah, I think that is so important to talk about, is like the athletes have this platform to create impact. And that's really the idea behind athlete activism, right? Is using the platform that you have because of your athletic ability, but using that platform and awareness for good to help others. And so what kind of impact are you seeing, and why is this so important? Like, is there impact being made? Can you kind of give us examples of how this actually makes a difference?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a really good point. And our team is one of them is the management group for Players Coalition, which is specifically it's an athlete-led social justice organization focused on 4 different areas within the system when it comes to criminal justice reform, police community relations, economic mobility, and education. And with that, we used a very intentional approach where it was, kind of working backwards. The players would tell us what issues were most important to them within those guiding objectives. And then we do surround ourselves with subject matter experts to identify what in the system is failing those communities that are important to them. And then look to see what legislation is tied to that, or what elected officials, maybe need to be aware of, and how we put impacted citizens in front of elected officials. And so we can point to over 22 pieces of legislation since 2017 that the Players Coalition has helped pass because of their support when it's come to either, raising the age of when juveniles can be arrested, allowing, voter voter restoration in Florida. We've helped infuse $1 billion into the Massachusetts education system. And we work with those athletes and figure out the legislation, and then build a campaign around it and say, okay, here's the background on this issue. You're going to talk to these elected officials. We're going to do media around it. The players are very educated by the time they go out and speak publicly on it, and they have the facts. It's always, data-driven facts to be able to go and understand or speak to why this is so important on these issues. So it's been a very intentional way. It's the long game. And I know this past year, we saw a lot of people just wanting to hurry up and do something. And there was a lot of momentum with voter turnout and all of those issues. But now that has passed a little bit, and now we're kind of settling, we're trying to make sure that we still keep people engaged and understand there's a lot more work to be done, and it's not overnight.
Well, no, I think you brought up a good point, that it does take a while to see some of this impact. And I love that you brought up the Players Coalition, because I think they're such a great example, and the work you guys are all doing about the amount of time. So this was put together, pre-2020. This was put together back in, I think, 2016, 2015? Is that right?
Yeah, right. The very first unofficial meeting was in 2016. There was 5 players who we went to Capitol Hill, and it was an off Tuesday in the middle of the NFL season. And Anquan Bolden looked around the league and wanted to identify who was doing the work and who was doing it the right way, and identified Malcolm Jenkins and a couple others. And they went to kind of do their first listen and learn. And so we spent all day on Capitol Hill just going, okay, where do we start? Here's the issues that are important to us. How does this work? And we learned 2 things that day. We learned that doors flew open when you have professional athletes walking around Capitol Hill, and that everyone is a sports fan. And so we had opportunities to speak with elected officials and get meetings that people have been waiting years on. And we also learned that most of the work needed to be kicked back to the state and local level. So while federal, had some issues and things that we could focus on, most of the real immediate work could happen back there. So we've kept that approach this whole time. And that's really helped keep some guardrails on the work that we've been doing. And I think when the murder of George Floyd happened, and we saw the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, we ended up being the people's first phone call. So people kind of knew that the Players Coalition was around and knew we were doing this work, but we were in a really good position to be able to get players and teams to dive right in and say, here's what you need to do. Okay, you're mad and outraged about the George Floyd murder. Let's end, qualified immunity. Here's that action plan, and really giving them a roadmap for change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to point out, is that this was something you guys put together over the years. And then at a moment where everyone was like, we need to do something, you had tangible work and information on, here's how we could do it. Here's how the system works and how we can work to change it. and how all of you can do that. So I think, again, like talking about the Players Coalition is just a great example of the fact that, the goal is to improve social justice, racial equity, everything that you just talked about. And over the years, you've been slowly doing that. I mean, 22 legislative, changes, that's huge. And I think, when you look at some of the activism over the last year, you don't want it to be a flash in the pan, right? You want it to continue. And so I think that importance of like, let's look at how it works. If it's too big, we need to scale it down. Like, I think all of that is really good to hear. And I want to know too, like, how do you guys work with the athletes in, let's say, the Players Coalition or in some of the other endeavors around athlete activism or athlete impact that you support? What is your focus? Is an athlete coming to you and saying, I have this opportunity, can you support us? Is it more of a Players Coalition style where you're kind of helping them manage the actual coalition ins and outs? Like, tell us a little bit about your role and how it's contributing.
Sure. It's definitely evolved, and it's taken a few years to really get a good system down. And now we're able to, we work mainly directly with the athletes, which has been a really important point, especially when we first started, it wasn't popular. In fact, a lot of agents and reps were concerned about what their clients were doing and if they were protesting, what that looked like. And so we found most of our success just dealing with the athlete directly. We had quick approvals, we had athletes showing up. And so it definitely changed our momentum early on and gave us a lot to come out the gate with on support wise. And so now when we have an athlete, a lot of it is word of mouth or people reaching out or connecting us. So we'll have an athlete call us or we'll reach out. We see that they're, doing stuff on social, and we have just something as simple as an intake form now. And we say, okay, what are the issues important to you? Check all these boxes. What communities do you have ties to? So where do you live? Where did you play college ball? Where did you play professional? What that looks like. And then how do you prefer to communicate? And then what level of participation? Are you going to go to meetings and sit with elected officials? Are you comfortable speaking out in press conferences? Or you just want to start out that social media awareness? Like, there's all kinds of levels of engagement. So that way we're able to really consolidate. And when we have asks, they go specifically to that player. So they're not getting these blanket requests. We're saying, hey, Danielle, I know you're interested in education equity in Virginia. There's a bill that's coming up that, will help public school systems. And so we're able to get that specific ask. Here's the ask. We need you to post this on social, and we need you to attend this town hall with these elected officials. Here's the talking points. And so we really just package it in a very clean, easy, turnkey way. We couldn't do that without our incredible subject matter experts who give us the real-time information on the ground, who understand how we work and how quickly that turnaround can be. And so we've just been able, it's just become so just like a really strong engine moving as we get to that point. And then we're able to see, small things, not small things, excuse me, but, we had, there was a bill here in California that is, one vote away from being passed around racial equity in policing. And so we had players come out and do town halls for that and do social for that. And so when we're able to say, hey, this bill got this far, and we hear on Capitol Hill that your awareness is kind of sparking some buzz, that's exciting. And the athletes are competitive and they want to win and they keep going for more. So it's been really incredible to see the direct impact and meet the people that lives are changing because of the laws that we're helping support.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're talking about like communicating with the players about the impact they're making, because I think that's a big thing that is important. It seems so simple. Like, yes, tell me if the bill passed, or like what the status is, or if people are excited about it. Like, did it get 20 more votes than it would have without you, right? That's really important. But I love that you also mentioned those subject matter experts that come in and keep you and your team informed, that say, hey, here's what's going on. Because I think it is important that you don't take everything on yourself, and where you can be the most impactful. And it sounds like you guys have a really great group of experts that can say, hey, for any of your players that are located in this area and passionate about this, this is what you want to know. This is what you want to tell them, versus trying to be that subject matter expert yourself.
That is such a good point, because I am, anyone who knows me knows that we stay in our lane. I am in sport management. I am not an expert. I have learned a lot of the details and the legalities that go into the issues that we're focusing on more so than I ever did. But I do not ever claim to be a social justice expert. I know how to get the players to do the work and I know how to manage that piece of it. But I have seen a lot of groups pop up who have similar backgrounds to me acting like the experts now or positioning themselves. And I think people don't understand too, is that there's some bills that come out and sign on this and do this, and everyone gets excited because it's something to tangibly do. But sometimes those bills could do more harm than good. Sometimes they become watered down and you end up hurting the people that you're trying to help in the long run. And so there's really important ways to do this the right way. And so we really pride ourselves on that and making sure that everyone has their roles. And, I never speak as an expert ever, ever, ever.
Yes. No, it's probably a good idea. And I think you're right. Like, I think now we're seeing the trend of activism, right? It's cool to be an activist. Like, it's awesome. Public opinion has totally shifted around it versus, maybe even 3 or 4 years ago where it was like really touchy. Like you mentioned, like agents and people that worked with athletes were like, don't say anything. You're going to ruin your brand. Now it's like the flip. It's like, can you make a statement? Can you do something? So I want to talk to you about like, how do you advise athletes that maybe be stepping into this for the first time, or they're maybe not sure, like maybe they have some interest, but they're not really sure where to go. How do you build those relationships? How do you create that trust? And how do you empower them to make those correct decisions for their brand or their own, communities?
That's a really good question as well. And I know, we've taken a lot of effort. My whole career has been built on discretion, and everyone who knows me knows that, just loyalty and discretion, and making sure that we are very careful about who we speak to and use names publicly and all of that. So when we have a player come to us and say, look, I'm just not quite comfortable right now, but I still want to learn, we make sure that we create an environment that allows them to sit in on meetings, listen in, being able to understand, here are some of the issues. Let's set up a way where maybe you need to hear from some of the impacted citizens and understand what those stories are. So then you're more comfortable speaking out to it. There's also easier entry points when it comes to the social justice efforts. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to come out the gate and say, hey, we need to end cash bail, or we need prosecutor accountability now, like things that could get into the weeds sometimes. But there's education equity, there's food insecurities, there's other ways to get involved and get your feet wet that I think sometimes make it easier and more comfortable as the player grows and understands their platform. But every single player, no matter what level of engagement, I have been blown away. Every single one of them that we have worked with, reads every briefing document we provide. They do their own research. No matter how much information we give them, they come back at us with more. And so they really make sure that they're studying and understand everything. They ask us questions, anytime they go out and speak publicly. So I can't say enough about the players we work with.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it clearly shows that they're engaged and want to do the work with you guys, which I think is an important part of what you're doing. And I want to hear too, like with you and your staff, how do you guys handle conversations with maybe teams, agencies that you mentioned before that might work with athletes? Like, do you have these conversations where the athlete says, I want to do this, but I'm not really sure how my agent or my team is going to react, or maybe they have a brand partner that they don't want to risk that relationship. Like, have you stumbled across that? And like, how do you create that sense of, okay, here's how we could address these kinds of issues? Because I'm sure it's not always like we're in and everything's smooth and I'm not worried about anything.
Right. Not so much on the brand side, especially lately. I think that brands really understand the importance and the value, like you said, the importance that activism is playing now. But when it comes to the team side, we always tell teams, and I always have my team tell the teams that we work with, like, we're here to be as much of a support or as little of a support as you need, because we're not trying to go in and step on toes. 3 or 4 years ago, there weren't social justice departments and there weren't, people specifically assigned to this. And as the time has evolved, particularly after last year, we're now seeing entire departments dedicated to these efforts. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic now. There's some teams who every social justice decision, they'll come to us because they understand, we're a complementary resource. They understand the infrastructure that we have in place. They understand our vetting process and our approach to everything and appreciate that. and understand that we're not trying to come in and, take their jobs away. We're trying to make them look good. And we're trying to ultimately, what's most important is help these players create systemic change. And then there's other times where, it can feel a little bit like trying to get protective, and they want to do their own thing, and sometimes the organization has their own issues they want to focus on. It's typically not as aggressive as the individual athletes, and that's why we like to allow this platform with the Players Coalition, where they can speak really aggressively on these issues that sometimes the teams won't come out and support. So it's certainly an interesting dynamic. And, we've built such great relationships with so many teams and representatives over the years. We're on calls with them, multiple times a week with people in different capacities, whether on the league side or not. So it's been great to see them grow. And they know that we're here always as a resource. They can always call us anytime, and we'll support that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I completely understand. And I'm sure as things have evolved for these teams and organizations, they also want to know what resources are out there, and they have those folks that are stepping into these roles. But I'm sure it's really nice for some of them to know, again, like we talked about, you guys have been doing this work for years now, and the major players, and you just know, who to contact maybe about some of the stuff that they might not be aware of. But, I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up too, about maybe different priorities from a team or organization versus the player themselves. And I want to kind of ask this. Obviously, there's backlash potential for any kind of stand that a player might take, but why is it important for organizations, and whether it's a brand or a team or an agency, to give and support not only their athlete clients, but their employees, the platform to address equity within their industry, within their firm? Why do you guys, have you stumbled across that changing over the years? Do you see that? And why is that important? Because I see you talking about, the organizations having questions and maybe have their own priorities. How do you rectify what your employees and what your athletes want to do versus what you're trying to do as an organization, I guess, is an easier way to ask that question.
Sure. Yeah, that's another really good question. And, I think a lot of it just comes down to support. So when the Players Coalition, had those early conversations with the NFL, it wasn't necessarily, hey, we need you to fund these efforts. That wasn't the focus. It was, we need you to listen to us and understand that these issues are important to us. We don't stop being who we are when we go home after a football game,
right,
or a baseball game, or whatever that looks like. And so when you're talking about so many of your constituencies being impacted by these issues, it's important to listen. And when you look at support, a team doesn't necessarily need to agree with an issue. We've done a lot around ending juvenile life without parole. And we've had a lot of players from the area come together and support that legislation. But the team was hesitant to do so. And that was okay, but because we were still there to fight that fight. But I think things like sending out a press release saying, hey, our players are involved with this. That doesn't necessarily need to say that, we back, this piece of legislation. It means that you support your athlete, your player going out there and focusing on these issues that's so important to them. Even just simple things like social media. We're proud of, Danielle for doing this, in her community. And I still don't think that's always understood. But it's such an easy thing to do. And it would go such a long way with some of these players, and things have changed a little bit, but the early days, it was like, I can't even go, my team will say no, and that's difficult to hear, but then we were here as that resource for them.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction, is it doesn't have to be, we endorse the law or the bill that they're endorsing, but we give them the platform to say, whatever you think is important to fight for, we are here as a support system. So I love that word support. And I think that translates even to, the sports industry in general, right? Is that we need to also be supporting the athletes in everything that we're doing and giving them the opportunity to have those, opportunities to stand up, to support, to speak out on issues, instead of saying, do we agree, yes or no? Let's just give them the chance to speak and give them that safe place to do so. So I think that's a really great point, is it's that distinction that I think that's a great way to highlight it. And I think the last couple questions I have for you, and I appreciate you taking so much time to chat with us, is around just general, the sports industry in general, and really building equity within the industry. And it sounds like you've had a lot of conversations, even pre-2020 around building equity, not only in sports, but outside of it. And some very controversial topics, right? We're talking about bills and laws and divides in our political system that you're working on with certain players that feel certain ways and maybe certain folks that feel very differently about that. And I think there's a lot of maybe a lack of transparency in terms of how do these conversations happen. And so I'd love to hear from you, like, are a lot of these conversations moving from reactionary to proactive? Just kind of from your angle and looking at how players are approaching this, how maybe some teams are reaching out to you as a resource. How do you see this moving and how do these conversations continuing to develop? Because I'm sure they're happening, just maybe not in the public view.
Sure. I think it's getting to a point where it's certainly proactive and being prepared, and um, also a lot of sitting down within the organizations, and not necessarily the Players Coalition having a role in that, but the organizations, the teams, the leagues. Okay, what is important to us? And where do we focus, and what are our mission statements when it comes to these social justice efforts, and how are we going to support the players? What's the team going to get behind? And so you're seeing a lot more. There's just no sitting around being reactionary. When something happened, and those were the early days of Players Coalition. It would we would never speak out when the former president would try to say something, or if there was like just a headline grab, like we just stayed quiet and kept our head down and did the work. And I think that really now shows. And now I think the teams are better equipped and have their own, resources to be able to say, okay, this is how we're going to approach this issue. Even things like when knowing that the George Floyd murder trial verdict was coming out, everybody was very prepared, wanting to make sure that, they had messages that mattered to the players and that still stayed true to the organization. And so it's definitely headed in the right direction. And one of the things I wanted to point out, which is really important from a behind the scenes infrastructure standpoint, is that after last year, we saw a lot of leagues form their own. People think the Players Coalition is NFL only, and it's not. It's 12 different professional sports that we have represented now, which is incredible. Awesome. And over 2,000 athletes with different touch points. I mean, it's just incredible to see the growth. When we started with 5 players, 4 years ago. But what we saw was so many athletes demanding more from their leagues, which was really impressive. And so we kind of, stepped in and said, hey, like, we have this experience navigating through the NFL and what that looks like, and what would benefit most for these issues. Let us help you. But we also realized the importance of the autonomy, because when the Players Coalition was being founded, it wasn't NFL Players Coalition. It was a separate entity. It's its own 501c3, C4, no attachments to any other organization but itself. And so we understood wanting that autonomy from the leagues. So when we saw groups like Black Players for Change out of MLS, Black Lacrosse Alliance, the women's soccer group formed, we were able to create, we had the infrastructure in place, and we were able to create affiliate programs. So we now house those, from a business sense, we house those organizations, and they're considered affiliates and extensions of the PC. So they are able to still focus what their league specific issues are and agenda items are. And then they come together with the Players Coalition to impact the community efforts that are impacting everyone at large. And so helping them kind of navigate through those league conversations has been really rewarding and exciting, because we want people to learn from our growing pains. And it's just been, I think the players would say too, that it's been a great resource for them, and they feel, like they really are supported in this space when it comes to social justice.
Oh, that's so great. I didn't know that they were all, tied in as affiliates. I think that's a really awesome way to do it. Like you said, learning from some of the growing pains you guys had, but I think that's awesome. And clearly it's giving them a chance to focus on what matters and the work they want to do, and not having to worry about, okay, how do we set this up? Like, how do we plan this event? Or how do we get people out there? You guys can say, hey, this is how we've done it. Let us help you with intake forms or all of this kind of stuff, right? I think that's a really great way to set it up. So that's really cool to hear that it's also growing and spreading outside
They've
of.
done an incredible job. I mean, they have their own, focus. They have gotten a lot out of their leagues. They've mobilized in a way I've never seen. They've done an incredible across the board. Incredible.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And I think it's kudos to you all for putting kind of an infrastructure together that translates to supporting them. And I think that's really what we're trying to do with these conversations is highlight the work that folks within the industry, like you said, you work in sport management, that's your area of expertise, right? And so I think just showing the impact that you're making, are you, like you said, like holding a microphone at the protests or at these bill signings saying, this is what we're doing and this is it? No, that's not your lane. Your lane is helping build the programs and the infrastructure and connecting the dots, right? And so I think that's a valuable piece of a takeaway for anyone listening, that the work that you do to support some of these things, whether it's for an organization or a team or a player, it does make a difference. And it doesn't have to look a certain way or be in front of a camera for people to feel that impact. So I think that's awesome. And clearly the work you guys are doing, keeping your head down and keeping your heads down and working is paying off because it's spreading. And I just have one more question for you before we let you go. I think especially for people in the industry that we're in, a lot of folks are still afraid to kind of dive into this equity conversation or not sure where to start. They don't want to say the wrong thing, right? They don't want to, jump in and seem performative versus actually wanting to make a change, right? It's that performative line. So, what would be your general piece of advice, right? One thing that each of us can really start to think about within our own roles, and let's keep it within sports, right? So, how can each of us within our own roles in sports keep momentum going, keep the momentum going from these 2020 protests, from the players speaking out since 2016 with the work you guys are doing, but also today, right? How do we each play a role in that, in your opinion?
That's a tough question. I think because I don't want to not do that it justice, because it's a really important question. I know, if I'll just speak from myself, I know that when it comes to equity, we make sure that, we put our money where our mouth is, even when it comes to when you're looking at, women's equality. And I make sure that I hire other females, to do a job that most organizations aren't all female dominated in sports, and so that's something that's really as a matter of pride for me. When it comes to fighting these issues, I think that people need to understand that you don't need to be out in the streets protesting, and you don't need to agree with some of the things that you see, but you need to find out what's important to you, and you need to go in and see how you can make an impact. Everyone can make an impact on an individual level, and I think when it comes to even things like voting, it's so simple, but it's so impactful and so important. And people need to understand that activism, there's no time off from activism. Like, there's always people in need, there's always going to be people who need to have a voice to speak out for them. And you kind of you have that in your heart, and you need to speak to that and do what you can to make sure that you're practicing and looking around at the resources that you may have.
It's a fantastic answer. I love it. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I mean, I think it hits the nail on the head, is that it's really about each of us figuring out what we want to do, right? What change we want to make, and figuring out our strengths and ability to actually go out and tackle that. So I think it's amazing advice.
It can be exhausting, and it can be discouraging when you see bad things, you see what's happening in just, one particular state recently. It's just like so disheartening. And then you go, how do I do this? And then you just keep focusing on what you can do and what you can control. And and when you're surrounding yourself with like-minded people, there's so much beauty in that. I get so much energy from that. So I know that's what keeps me going over here.
No, I love it. I think that's great. And again, it's it's everyone's own decision on what work they want to do, what impact they want to have. And so I think that's a great piece of advice, is like, surround yourself with good people, figure out what you want to make an impact on, and just work hard and work to get there, and know that it's not going to just like snap your fingers, we did it, right? It's going to be a long journey, but every little step forward makes an impact on somebody. So I think that's a really great way to close us off here. And before we do let you go, if people want to learn more about LaChica Sports, want to connect with you, or want to learn more about the Players Coalition, just give us some links and places they can find you.
All right. So for information with LaChica Sports, we're at LaChica Sports on Instagram, Players Coalition at Players Coalition on Instagram. You can find out all the events and upcoming town halls and ways to get involved when it comes to issues that matter most. And then, of course, my personal LinkedIn is just Angela LaChica. You can find me there and would be happy to connect with you.
Awesome. Well, Angela, thank you so much for taking time to sit down with us around this interview series with the Making Sports More Equitable Coalition. We're really excited to highlight all the good work you've been doing, and we really appreciate your time. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all you all are doing.
Awesome.